have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Hum.
I'm Ann Northrup. And today we have a very special show for you. As you know, 2019 is the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion, riots, whatever you want to call it. And we are kicking off our coverage of it with an hour panel discussion with people involved in various angles of it. So I guess I should start on my immediate left. Eric Marcus is the author of Making Gay History. Making History here. Is this the original book? Yeah. Okay. But the producer of the MakingGayHistory.org podcast, now in its 4th year, sound from interviews you did 30 years ago. And next to him is Martin Boyce, an original Stonewall veteran. You were there the nights of the riots. He's going to tell us all about that. Carla Jay, also an original member of the Gay Liberation Front, as well as Red Stockings, Radical Lesbians, a professor emeritus from Pace University, author of many books, including The Gay Report with Alan Young. Lesbians and gay men speak out about sexual experiences and lifestyles. And that was not done yesterday, Carla. And Jamie Adams, who is the park ranger in charge of the Stonewall National Monument down at Sheridan Square on Christopher Street. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Martin, I think you were there the first nights. We should start with you. Tell us what happened.
Okay. First night was...
How old were you at the time?
I was 20. And it was the beginning of a weekend. It was sad for some people because Judy Garland had passed away, and we all went to see her body. And that night, during the weekend, we would go to Stonewall very late. And we had plans, and that we would do. But on my way to Stonewall, I met a friend who said you were not getting in. Because in Stonewall, they could choose who could get in on different nights.
Even though it was a kind of creepy bar?
Even though. Because they didn't want it to tip. Not too many drag queens, not too many scare drags, not too many rowdies. Mm-hmm. They always had a balance in there, which made the bar very interesting. Mm-hmm. But it was sad, you know. It was almost like, you know, later in Studio 54 if you couldn't get in. Yeah. We knew because he was our type, scare drag.
Now, define scare drag.
Well, scare drag is not full drag. Scare drag, if any image could come to mind, I would say Boy George. Okay. They would think you were a girl for a second, a minute, and then reality would come. Okay. Which was fine with me, because it wasn't so much an identity for me, it was a protest, you know.
Right.
So, and these people too. So we were talking about what to do now. We're not going to get into Stonewall, and it was a pity because the music was great and we wanted to dance. But someone behind me, there were crowds always, but said something about a raid. So right away, what we normally did in a raid was rush to see the show. And we had the sense of Schadenfreude. You know, it wasn't us. Now we can watch the show.
And by raid, you mean cops coming into the bar to raid?
The whole scene. This was going to be interesting now in Stonewall. I went there, and sure enough, they had just taken the drag queens out because I heard cheers, and I knew that, well, this is going to be interesting. But as I got close to this one cop in the paddy wagon, a foot came out as he was pushing someone in, a high heel, and kicked him back. But he jumped in, and what sobered me was a sound of flesh and bone against metal. And he took care of the thing. He was a very ugly cop. And he closed the door, and we were just around him. Now we were all in an amphitheater around the opening. And he turned around and he said, "All right, you faggots, the show is over. Now get the fuck out of here." And he turned around because he was sure. He gave the command and we would obey, like people that just listen because we've been so oppressed. But we didn't. We didn't talk to each other. We were leaderless, but we all took a step towards him. I could see the hairs on his neck go up. He turned around to really say it now, but he didn't say it. I don't know what we looked like, but whatever it was in his eyes, what he saw. And he gulped and blinked, and in our section, the riot was on. Because provocation, there was enough provocation for everybody, enough provocation in the whole semicircle to cause the riot everywhere. And all of a sudden, everything went crazy. We went for them. And it was very fierce, because we almost felt as if our oppressors, our guards at Dachau, were now by consensus under our control. And that gives you a false sense of power. And I think we just wanted to hurt them in every which way possible.
And they're showing a moment of vulnerability.
The vulnerability did it. I think we would have stayed back a little bit had he not shown that vulnerability. But his fear and our hate combined just to make us crazy.
And Martin, you had reason to be angry given what you were how you were treated as a teenager growing up in New York.
Oh yes, I mean, gay bashing was a sport. Because, you know, in your New York in those days, you lived in your neighborhood like a village. For maybe 30, 40 years, people lived there. So to be labeled gay was a horrible destiny. You know, for me, it wasn't so bad because, you see, my mother was an invalid. So everyone, they tried to give you the excuse if they could, if they liked you, not to say you were gay. I was peculiar. My mother, you know, my father couldn't teach me baseball. Mm-hmm. So I had an in. I became a spy in the heterosexual, you know, edifice, because I would hear these boys talk about gay people, and it was like the worst thing you could be. I mean, you could be a murderer and have more respect. But I listened. I knew I had to listen because and I always listened, even from a child, because I thought, well, they're training us to be straight. Let me learn. I learned not to lift your pinky. If someone said, look at your nails, go like this, don't go like that. You have to learn all these things.
And then you had bad experiences with the police. Weren't you dragged down the steps of the Metropolitan Museum once?
Oh, yes, yes. It was, well, you know, we did feel freer and freer to speak in the late 60s. And I was, my outfit was an Isadora Duncan scarf, a 6-foot rayon scarf, and a low-cut top, which was called sort of like a Jezebel. It pushed you in. And I was very happy with my little clutch bag. It was my signature thing, my clutch bag. And I was walking up, we were going to the Met, me and Bertie, who was in the Stonewall riot with me. And the cops were taking down their barricades. And one of them, they were in plainclothes, said to me, I said, oh, I didn't know you could be like that and be in the police force. And that was it. You know, Bertie and I laughed, he didn't. I should have known. And we kept on our way to the Met now, 4 more blocks. As I'm in front of the Met, all of a sudden, the scarf pulled, tightened, twisted into a tourniquet. I was thrown against the car. It was him on top of me, telling me, you never disrespect a police officer. He kept turning that. I was blue as a Smurf.
Well, I'm glad you didn't end up like Isadora Duncan.
No, I didn't. I didn't.
Wow.
I find this idea of a bar raid as spectacle is so interesting, because for me, bar raids, which were prevalent in the lesbian community as well, the idea of a bar raid was terrifying in many respects. For one thing, in most of these bars, the back doors were padlocked, so there was no way out. If there was a bar raid, if there was a fire, you were trapped in there. And if the police arrested you in the bar raid and got your identification, which it was a no-win situation. If you didn't have identification, they were going to take you away. If you did have identification, they would then use that identification to ruin your life. Even though they might not arrest you, if you were wearing gender-correct clothing, then they might call your school, call your employer, call somebody and tell them that you were a lesbian and you were found in this bar they had raided. And your life would be ruined, even without having been arrested, without having been booked, tried, without anything, your life was over. So for me, you know, the idea that a bar raid could be something interesting to watch For me, when I heard about bar raids happening, for me that was horrifying news. Wherever those bar raids happen, I didn't find them at all entertaining. I have to say.
Well, Street Queens already ruined. So that was the bottom line.
Yes, but they weren't the only ones who were,
they were the ones that were in the
these.
forefront of the Stonewall situation.
Yes.
So, Carla, tell us about what your background and what brought you into the movement and into the Gay Liberation Front.
I was involved in the student uprisings at Columbia University in the spring of 1968, and then I joined the women's movement because the men at Columbia thought that women should be involved making sandwiches for them. So I quickly left the old new left and moved on to the Red Stockings. But Red Stockings felt that the personal is political unless you're a lesbian, and then the personal was personal. And they really weren't that excited about talking about anything except men. I thought they were. Red Stockings reminded me a little bit of Weight Watching groups I had been in, where all they talk about is food. And the women in Red Stockings like to talk about men, and they didn't want to talk about women. So when I heard about the Stonewall uprisings, and I was the only lesbian in New York who was not there, I do bill myself as that, I did get myself down to the Gay Liberation Front shortly after they started meeting, about a month later.
Well, that's the significance of Stonewall, isn't it? That it led to immediate organizing. GLF, Gay Liberation Front, was formed in the midst of the rebellion.
Yes. Let me say that there were bar raids in the 1930s and 1940s in Buffalo, Compton Cafeteria in California, Barney's Beanery. There were many sites of resistance in the LGBTQ communities where we fought back against the police. The difference between the Stonewall uprisings and the other bar raids is that the GLF started to organize a commemoration a year later. And if we hadn't commemorated the uprisings with a march a year later, I don't think that anybody would be celebrating the Stonewall now. It was really another sad, most people think it was a mafia-run bar. If we go to March 1970, there was a much more tragic bar raid in which Diego Vinales, after being arrested, such a poignant story now, he was an illegal immigrant, and when he was taken to the 10th precinct, he jumped out of the second-story window, landed on a spiked fence. The fire department came and had to blowtorch the fence. They took him away to St. Vincent's Hospital with the fence still in him. The fence was sticking out of his stomach as they took him away. That was the end of bar raids in New York, not the Stonewall.
No, but the spirit of Stonewall, it was important. It was that spirit.
Important,
wasn't
but it
the
was
only
commemoration.
The police was so bad
important.
that sometimes a non-drinking establishment could be raided.
Yes.
Before Stonewall, there was a 10th of Always where they didn't serve drinks. But still, we knew that it could happen, but we didn't think it would happen because we were young kids. Nothing was wrong. No, they came in. The lights went on. We had to stop dancing. A detective came in, looked in each of our faces. He looked like Orson Welles in A Touch of Evil. He was supposed to terrorize us with his cigar. And it was all silly. But they did it. I mean, they just relentless. But the spirit of Stonewall, because the gay world had changed between the 60s and the gay press, gay pulp fiction. It was a changed world. Yes. Stonewall was one incident in the middle of the village.
But it did seem, in addition to the commemoration, it did seem to lead to this ongoing exponential organizing.
Yes, but something that we have to remember is that the first meeting that was held after Stonewall, after the uprising, was organized by the Old Line movement, by the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. It was Dick Leitch and Martha Shelley.
And they'd been around since the 50s.
Well, Mattachine was founded in 50, Daughters of Bilitis in 55, so there was an existing infrastructure to build on. So it was at that meeting of the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis that GLF got its start, the Gay Liberation Front. So, and you're right about
against Dick's wishes. You know, Martha and some of the others went off, and Martha allegedly pounded on the table and said, "Oh, let's call it the Gay Liberation Front."
That's Martha Shelley.
And Martha Shelley and you know, Mattachine had put a sign in the window of the Stonewall telling people more or less to go home and settle down. And this all came, you know, on the tail of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and things, you know, as you're pointing out, Mort, things were no longer going to settle down. It was a very important moment in history, and things could no longer settle down.
So, Jamie,
the war in Vietnam was a big moment.
You're there now, and people come up to you, and your park. Do they know to ask you about what happened at Stonewall, or do they say, "Who the hell are you? What are you doing here?"
It's a mix. I get both. Some people may have already heard that it was designated as a national monument, so they came specifically looking for either the Arrowhead sign or a national park's passport stamp that every park gets.
Looking for the entrance to drive into.
Sure. The same kind of thing they get at the Statue of Liberty or the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or the, you know, up in Seneca for the women's rights site.
But it's just a little quarter.
So it's just this
village.
little park. So it's really not about, you know, preserving the park. It's really preserving, yes, the park as well, but preserving the story. And so when people approach me and want to know what on earth I'm doing there, I immediately have to launch into that story.
Yes. And what do you tell them?
Well, again, I have to gauge the audience. Always.
Well, who comes? Who comes?
It's a mix. It really is. You get these very conservative-seeming, very straight-seeming families that are traveling to all the different national parks for the summer and just again want to get that stamp. And a lot of those folks do it because they know that for some reason the U.S. government at some point said, "Oh, this is something worth preserving," and so even if I don't know anything about it, my kids should learn from this ranger.
Nice.
So they know. And we have incentives to help, you know, youth learn. We have the Junior Ranger program, so it's a special badge, and so we're finally going to have that for 2019, which is expected by a lot of national park fans. But we also have people who just want to come and see Stonewall, or they want to come and see, you know, the Gay Liberation Monument within the park because they've heard about
it's
that.
Not the original Stonewall bar, and the original bar, you know, do you tell them that was to the right of where the current bar is?
I do. Depending on how much time I have with people and where their interests seem to lie, we can really get into these things.
Well, as we pointed out, when we fought for the Stonewall Monument, it wasn't so much about the bar, because the bar is really not part of it. It's the streets, because that's where the rebellion happened, in the streets.
Yes, I think it was a mistake to call this the Stonewall Monument and not the Stonewall Uprising or the Stonewall Riots Monument, because the work of men and women like this person here, that's what's important, not the fact that there was this particular bar there or that particular bar, but what people like him did and what we did afterwards.
Well, good to have anything.
And the word uprising. Right. Yes, it is good to have it.
It's kind of funny the way it worked out, because the word Stonewall is now so symbolic.
Yes.
You know, and so of course when they did the designation, that's what they were latching onto. They know they weren't really latching onto necessarily the bar, but you know, we have different pride celebrations internationally that either use Christopher Street or Stonewall, and they cling to these terms and may not even know exactly where that name is coming from. And of course, I have to mention that there's confusion from those very conservative folks that may not know anything, and they do the Stonewall Jackson correlation, and then they see Phil Sheridan standing on a pedestal in our park and really get confused. You know,
because it's Sheridan Square.
Exactly.
Did you get any negative visitors?
Very few.
That's
Martin, very few. I'm proud to report that it's very few.
Great.
And it is. It's really something. June 2016 is when it was designated by President Obama, and I've been out there for 3 summers, and for 3 summers it's been pure joy.
Yes, the president invoked Stonewall, but it was the last president, and you got to meet with him, with Danny Garvin, who, may he rest in peace, at the White House.
That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever imagine, Martin, that...
No. And, you know, I couldn't imagine because this was a fag rebellion. I didn't think it would end the White House at any point.
Well, and in fact, one of your interviewees, Vito Russo, who we have a small audio clip from, talks about how he had no idea where this was going to lead. So maybe we can play that little clip from Vito Russo, who I knew later in ACT UP and author of The Celluloid Closet, but he was there hanging out in the trees. Clip?
I went across the street to the park. There's that little triangular park, and I sat in a tree.
You were primarily an observer?
Yes. I had no connection or knowledge that there was, in fact, the beginnings of an activist movement going on right around that issue. By the time I got there, it was basically over. I went across the street to the park. There's that little triangular park, and I sat in a tree.
You were primarily an observer?
Yes. I had no connection or knowledge that there was, in fact, the beginnings of an activist movement going on right around that issue.
I spoke with Vito in 1989.
Yeah.
And he said he wasn't aware of a movement until the snake pit raid, which you mentioned. But you have to wonder what would have happened if the snake pit had been the place where everything had ignited.
What was the snake pit? Talk about it.
Well, the snake pit raid that Carla mentioned earlier about, this is the raid where I think 200 people were arrested and Diego Vanellis wound up impaled on the fence. It happened in March of 1970.
Ah, right.
And Vito Russo happened to have seen a protest march go by the restaurant where he was working, and he joined the protest march. That's when he got involved in 70. But if you think about the names, Snake Pit versus Stonewall, would we have had the same kind of branding of this event if it had been in the Snake Pit? So Stonewall is perfect in a way.
Well, the first march was not called Stonewall.
It wasn't.
It was called Christopher Street Liberation Day Committee, and we called it the Christopher Street Gay Liberation March. So there would have been a different kind of branding without the name of the bar. And in fact, the Gay Liberation Front, which arose out of the ashes of Stonewall, Stonewall lit a fire, but the Gay Liberation Front lit a torch and then carried that torch the following year up 6th Avenue into the park. And the momentum of the Gay Liberation Front was to get people out of these bars. The bars, along with the police department, the bars were oppressing us. They were in collusion with the police department in terms of having us arrested. And there is also evidence now that the bars were involved in shaking down the patrons to get money out of them, to get some of these patrons who worked on Wall Street to turn over bonds and other materials, so that these bars, which were organized, which were run almost exclusively by organized crime, primarily by the Genovese crime family, at least this is what scholars say, these places were not our friends. We, as people back then, had no choice. There were no coffee houses, we had no center, we had no consciousness-raising groups. Today, people have a choice. If you want to go to a bar, that's great. But to not have a choice of any place on earth where you can meet, that's why they had us. And so I think that's really important to remember, that the early groups were trying to get people out of places like the Stonewall. This is not to disparage them today. I think they're important, and they play an important part in people's lives.
Tommy Lanigan Schmidt, who was like 18 years old, I believe, at the time when he was there, he said one of the reasons Stonewall was, we were so angry that Stonewall was taken from us because it was one of the few places we could dance and touch in the bar. Because in the old days, and I heard David Rothenberg talk about this, who's in his 80s now, he said he was in a bar and he was talking to a guy and he put his hand on the other guy's hand just to talk to him, and they threw him out of the bar just for that level of touch. So things changed.
But there was also a matter of turf. You know, we've all seen West Side Story, and everybody had turf. And gay people had no turf, except Central Park, but that was something else.
Small part of Central Park.
A small part of Central Park.
Deep in the bushes.
Christopher Street was our turf. It was the one. You know, when you were in Scared Drake, you had
gay
to.
men, not
of
our.
course.
When you say
yes.
our, I mean,
yes. I'm
Well,
making
I
that
was not
distinction.
cruising on Christopher Street.
No, I
But don't we
clear.
regret that we didn't cruise back in those days? Wouldn't we like to have
No,
done more of that?
I did plenty of cruising, just not up and down Christopher Street.
Okay.
But if you walked in the street, you had to keep one eye and one ear on your friend and look down that block and make sure who was ever coming to you, if they were too butch, to let the person know and either move, go across the street, or turn back. Christopher Street was the one place you didn't have to do that. There was such safety in numbers. You didn't have to look behind you. It was our turf. We finally had a place where you could be comfortable, at least.
And you feel that was after Stonewall?
That was before Stonewall.
Before Stonewall.
Before Stonewall. The raid destroyed that. It was our only turf. And it was so important without even speaking to each other. Because these street queens, of course, would never have made an organization like you did or could do that. But they did like the torch to pass it, merely because they were so desperate. I mean, we did go to the Mattachine Society once, 14 of us, I think, and we sat there. Everybody put on makeup to go because it was a big event, and they immediately threw us out.
But the Gay Liberation Front had elements of all of these people,
No,
including many
but
people
I'm
who've
talking
been
about
at
before Stonewall riot. I'm
Yes.
talking about
Yes.
these desperate queens who had no support system. Most of them were homeless, not homeless like today, institutionalized, episodic. They were young.
Street
they
kids.
would find a trick, you know.
Now, the Gay Liberation Front, from what I've read, I'm sorry not to have been part of it, did a lot of zaps, did a lot of demonstrations, did some great stuff that we, glommed off of earlier movements and that we've replicated in later movements. But it didn't last very long. So what happened to GLF?
GLF didn't morph into GAA, the Gay Activist Alliance.
Well, it's split.
It's split.
It did not morph.
Yeah, no, it's
morph, I
split.
think, would be.
One nice way of putting it. People think that this is that conflict within the movement is something new. Yeah. Conflict within the movement, it was there before the beginning. Yeah. And this was a case where there was a split. Gay Activist Alliance, which was a single-focused organization, was formed. GLF faded over time, and GAA led the movement forward.
Faded over time? Is that your...
No, I don't think that's true. For one thing, let me say this, because I've heard the same thing about Red Stockings and the radical women's groups I was in. We did not set up these organizations to exist in perpetuity like General Motors. We didn't have that kind of view of the world. We set up these organizations to accomplish certain functions. We didn't have a budget. At one point, I was the chairwoman of the GLF. Our treasury was $200. Mm-hmm. We didn't have money. No one was ever paid back then. We didn't see ourselves existing into the future. So we, as LGBTQIA and on, even though we were oppressed by other people in the same way, we didn't have that much in common. So eventually, the lesbians, or some of the lesbians, went off and became radical lesbians. The people like Marsha, Sylvia, Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Nova, Bubbles, they formed Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. There was a group called the Effeminists. They went off and they formed their collective and went off. There were many groups that went off, including GAA. This was a natural evolution of the group. And some members of the GLF were calling themselves the GLF way into the early 1980s. So it's hard to know whether groups faded or continued to exist. The group had served its function. And GAA did form in December of 1969 and continued to exist for a few years. And it too then
GAA, I was a member, I
existed.
joined in about 75. It lasted
Yes.
until about 80, I think, around approximately. But you're mentioning Marsha P. Johnson, a street drag queen and Sylvia Rivera, who worked the streets, and they are no longer with us. And they were very significant there. So talk about them and maybe bring in some of their actualities here. Because one of the things we don't have is people of color who were veterans at the time who are still around at this point that we know about.
Because I remember talking with you, Martin, about this, that many of the people you knew, the street kids, died early in life.
Yes, earlier than the AIDS epidemic. Yeah. Half of them.
Yeah. From what happened to them?
Drugs. And ill health. Bad, bad health, and using their bodies to find a place to live. To get money, spending money.
Right. A lot of them were homeless or semi-homeless.
And destroyed by untreated.
I mean, Marsha, that was true of Marsha and Sylvia.
Sylvia was on the streets since she was 10.
Right. So,
and she lived in New York. Grew up here.
I do want to use that audio clip you have from Sylvia because it's a nice little insight into one of the actions at the Stonewall Rebellion. So if we can play that brief.
I don't know if it was the customers or it was the police. It just, everything clicked. Everybody just like, why the fuck are we doing all this for? And the nickels, the dimes, the pennies, and the quarters started flying.
Why that? Why do people do that?
The payoff. That was the payoff. That was the payoff.
It was to symbolize the payoff.
Yep. You already got...
Here's some more?
And here's some more. To be there, it's just like, oh, it was so beautiful. I just like, it's like...
Was it exciting?
Oh, it was so exciting. It was like, ow, we're doing it. We're doing it. We're f***ing their nerves.
When you hear my reaction to Sylvia about the coins, several people had told me about the coins.
Being thrown at the cops.
And I didn't understand why. So when he says, the payoff. Now, there is some question as to whether Sylvia was actually there the first night.
Yes, there is.
And with an oral history, you take people at their word and let them speak for themselves. Now, Marsha P. Johnson, who we also have a clip from, and I interviewed both of them back in the late 80s, Marsha herself says, I didn't get there until 2 in the morning.
Yes.
Until it was mostly...
I was at a party uptown. I was late.
Right.
Yeah.
But with the pennies, it was also because they were made of copper, the coppers.
Yes.
This is something I didn't know, Mark.
So many layers of symbolism.
Are you writing all this down?
Got it all.
And if you have questions for this wonderful historic, just
I thought everybody was so intelligent not to throw the higher money. I just thought, they're so smart. They throw pennies, we'll all have money later. But then the quarters started going.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I was shocked as I started to read a little of the history that raids continued. I sort of thought Stonewall was the end of it. That was the culmination. But the police raids continued, and as you said at the state.
I mean, in 1982, they closed the 2 biggest lesbian bars in New York because it was just a vendetta against lesbians. And we had huge demonstrations, and we didn't get anywhere with the government that's supposed to be more responsive to us. And then there was the raid on the bar by the Times Blues, mostly transgender bar,
sometimes
right across from the New York Times.
And
they busted it up and broke everything. The police.
And we are still demanding or requesting or begging for an apology from the New York City Police Department and the city of New York. And they are still abusing gay people in this city.
And it is still not easy. I work with New Alternatives for Homeless LGBT Youth, for a transgender woman of color especially, to walk down the street in New York without just being arrested as a prostitute when they're just being themselves. They're not doing anything. They just get arrested. It still happens today.
I remember one of the boldest of the park raids. And it was not the police that was so emboldened. It was what we were going out, my friend and I. He wanted to go down into the pit for quick sex, and then we could go out. I was annoyed because
where was the pit?
The pit was in the Ramble.
In the park. In Central Park.
So I sat at the bench. I said, I'll wait for you, but come on, And all of a sudden, there were police with motorcycles walking them. One was coming very close to me, and it got me very nervous. I looked back, and there was one back there. And they couldn't do anything to me. I was just sitting there. It was night. And they turned one on, The other one went on, the other one went on, and I thought, my God, that's it. And they down there, some started singing, "Hooray for Hollywood." Da, da, da. And they were all arrested. Some of them were really, had their cases in front of them. They couldn't have been identified. But these irresponsible queens who made a show out of it, wrecked it for a lot of other people. But this is how involved they became.
I'm going to hope you're saying that with some irony, because we don't want to blame people for their behavior when the authorities are out to get them illegally and
But I don't think you should break out into a Hollywood tour.
I do. I do.
Because the person next to you,
Well, bring Marsha's voice into this if we can.
Right.
This is a clip. I interviewed Randy Wicker and Marsha P. Johnson together.
Randy is still with us. He
Yes.
was an activist since the 1950s, I believe.
Yes. Randy's one of the heroes of the movement, led the first public protest in 1964 at the Army Induction Center, the Whitehall Street Induction Center here in New York City. So long history.
Because they were protesting because they were releasing the records of people who said that they were gay.
Yes.
And exposing them.
Yeah, so Randy thought that the Stonewall Uprising was a disaster.
Oh, right.
And the people like Marsha B. Johnson were ruining things for everyone else. Lo and behold, Randy wound up taking Marsha when Marsha was living on the streets, and Marsha lived with Randy for 8 years.
That's a good story.
Yeah,
in Hoboken.
And worked in his lamp shop.
Yes. And so I interviewed, I had set up to interview Randy at his lamp shop, and he said, "Oh, come back with me to Hoboken," and I wound up interviewing Randy with Marsha P. Johnson, and that's what you hear. You'll hear Randy first.
Okay.
Marsha's the only one, she's the only one everyone agrees was at the Stonewall riots. There were a lot of other people, but everyone agrees that Marsha was there, so...
The way I winded up being at Stonewall that night, I was having a party uptown, and we were all out there, and Miss Sylvia and Rivera and them were over in the park having a cocktail. I was uptown, and I didn't get downtown until about 2 o'clock, because when I got downtown, the place was already on fire, and it was a raid already.
Randy made a wonderful documentary about Marsha that was really rich and terrific. Yeah.
And there's a big documentary made by David France about I believe it's called The Life and Death of
Yes,
Marsha
which is very different. It's a sort
Murder
of investigation,
mystery.
of her death, but I'm quite taken by Randy's documentary. And Jamie, I don't want to miss out on your story because your personal story is woven into this too. You were in the Coast Guard, you were serving in the years of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So talk to us about that and how that all resonates with this.
Sure. I was identifying as queer when I was 18 years old, but also knew that I didn't want to go to college and knew that I needed to figure something out. So I joined the Coast Guard and remember a document, part of the entry process to the military at the time, up until the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there was this document that actually explicitly states how you cannot at all express any homosexual tendencies. Do not let on to that, and don't ask anybody. If it was, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And I remember holding that and really having that minute and thinking, okay, here I go, I'm going to take the plunge. So I did. And I said, I'll just be closeted, and it was fine through basic training. But then I went out and was doing search and rescue on the Oregon coast in a town of less than 500 people. And all I could think about was my ex-girlfriend. So I spent the entire time active duty, really working hard to prove to everyone around me that I was just as good for the job as they were, but always feeling this guilt and this burden, and it affected me quite negatively for a long time. I got out with an honorable discharge and went on to serve in a variety of government jobs, and always wanted to be a park ranger, and luckily became one and was working at different historic sites around Manhattan when I started to hear that this Stonewall National Monument could maybe happen, or some kind of monument for gay rights.
And did this movement have any meaning for you during all this time? Were you aware of it? Because we always wonder, for people not actively involved in the movement, why aren't they more out, or why aren't they joining, or what? And I get the sense of this great disconnect.
Absolutely.
Where'd you grow up?
So I am a military brat. I've moved around my whole life. So I spent my teen years in South America, and so while I was going through my own self-discovery, I was quite closeted up until my time after the Coast Guard.
Did you know other gay people in the military? I mean,
I didn't.
You didn't know?
I did not know. I had heard of someone.
Did you hear? Did you hear homophobia in the ranks?
Absolutely.
You did.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Daily. It was part of the culture, unfortunately. So yeah, it created quite a bit of fear for me. But when I finally started to have more self-discovery time after the Coast Guard and started to date women, I found myself living in a great house with a great group of women who were way more involved and with activism and awareness than I had ever been, and they kind of put me on to the story of our struggle as far as the movement is concerned. And then years later, when I ended up coming to New York for a different government job, one of the first places I went was the Stonewall, because it really is a rite of passage still for so many people.
Well, we're going to try to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Stonewall with a civil rights march on June 30th. That's why we have the Reclaim Pride Coalition, and we're working on that, and we're working to build that. But I want to ask the veterans here, and that's, well, we're all veterans in that sense. Do you think we're further along than you expected back in the day when you got started, or not as far as we should be from what you expected?
Both, because, you know, our struggle, which is not finished, is also global. You know, and this is very important. I mean, I myself have to keep one eye on the news around the world, because I find it very helpful if the rest of the world comes with us. It's sad to look at a map that's only colored to a certain extent, free, gay-wise, and not for so many. I mean, this Taiwan situation, it was disappointing, you know. But
people voted against same-sex marriage,
you know, and all these assassinations, you want to call them, in Uganda and places like that. Even the Vatican's making these Ugandan children saints. They're famous within the Catholic Church for refusing to sleep with the king. And they rather, and he chopped them off. Like he killed them by cutting their legs off and throwing them in fire, little by little. And they became saints. You would think it would be a wonderful thing, but it's not. It was an anti-gay move. It was to show that these boys didn't give in, and they're saints, because homosexuality is evil and wrong.
Eric, you've been following this and the history for many, many years. Do you have a sense overall of, are we surprised at this happening at all? Or
I can't tell you how shocked. I feel like some of the people I interviewed who talked about feeling like dinosaurs when I interviewed them in their 70s and 80s, because they couldn't believe how much it changed, and they couldn't adjust. They had a hard time adjusting to the new world and the new rules. And I find that I still look over my shoulder thinking that someone's behind me. I still suffer from my own internalized homophobia. And I marvel at young people today who are growing up in a very different world. I'm thrilled by the change. And I think these are the best of times, in most ways, given where we were. There was a time when I was interviewed in the late 80s after my book, The Male Couples Guide, was published, and I was asked if I thought that gay people would ever be able to marry. And I said, never, not as long as not in my lifetime. You know, what did I know? What did I know?
And yet we don't have a federal LGBT rights law.
No, so there are still mountains to climb. Gives us old people something to do, Andy.
And more important, there are real willing climbers.
And there's a backlash.
And to segue off what Eric said, you know, at one of the first GLF meetings, we sat around and we said, what do we want? And someone said, oh, I'd like to be able to walk down the street and hold my lover's hand. And everyone nodded. And another woman said, I want to get married to my lover, and everyone laughed. It was the funniest thing we'd ever heard in our lives. We thought, "Whoa, we've got a wacko in here," you know.
And yet the Gay Activists Alliance did a demonstration at the Marriage Bureau, mainly because the head of the Marriage Bureau had insulted gay people. Not because they were trying to get married, but they were insulted.
Well, in the summer of 1970, I was on a poster for Gay in 3, which took place in the fall of 1970 in Los Angeles in the park. And one of the things we used to do these mock fake marriages. And there was a sit-in in LA at the Federal Plaza after the first Pride March. And one of the things was also to have kind of marriages which were not legally binding. However, that was an area in which we have at least temporarily succeeded, but I don't know if we succeeded in a broader civil rights agenda. And one of the things that we dropped from the old Gay Liberation Front was our alliance with other organizations. When we were involved back then, and we came out of these other movements, like the anti-war movement, and we came out of the women's movement, we were aligned with these other groups, and we cared about the struggle of black people in this country.
You had meetings with the Black Panthers.
We had meetings with the Black Panthers. We raised money for the Black Panthers. It was very controversial. We went to Earth Day back then, and we cared about all of these different groups. And today, people are very much on track with one organization. And that concerns me because, well, if we have LGBT marriage without an earth, well, what good is that going to do us? You know,
well,
it's going to be a false victory, I think.
After the Anita Bryant backlash of 1977, when the citizens of Miami overturned the gay rights ordinance, quite a shock to the system, we formed a coalition for lesbian and gay rights, and we got labor unions, and we got African American groups and women's groups, and we did all work together. We did try to keep that going for a long time, but those were the days when we weren't paid, like in the early days, weren't paid. Everybody was a volunteer, and we did a lot of what they now call intersectionality.
Yes, the professionalization of the movement, and I saw this coming out of ACT UP too, when the AIDS movement got professionalized, and it became less dynamic and a different animal. And I wonder whether you look back on those years 50 years ago and sort of yearn for that energy and that.
Well, I had a problem caring for other groups because they didn't care about me. And this, I was tired of, like, you know, again bowing, again because you are the great straight man, you know, or you are the straight woman of the feminist movement. It was always like that. I remember there was a feminist bank, and my sister was a great feminist, and we went, and the door was shut in my face. And I told them, I'm gay. You're a man, aren't you?
Well, yeah, when Betty Friedan insulted lesbians and called you the Lavender Menace, you did what?
We took over their conference.
Good.
And we said, we are on your agenda and we're not coming off. However, you know, one of the things we said in the women's movement is you cannot measure pain, and you can't measure other people's pain. And yet, throughout all the time in the women's movement, one of the things I learned in the GLF was that people like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, who lived on the street, had lived a much harder life than I had. And it is one of the graces of being in a big group like the GLF that I got to know people like them, like Jerry Hoos, who had a very different life from the life I had lived. And to get to know all of these different kinds of people and to meet Black Panthers, I mean, who I never would have met, you know, in the normal course of my life, together, you know, and to know that so many people in this country and around the world had such a more difficult time than I had, and that even though I was always struggling for myself, that I had to struggle for these other people as well. And I would like to see, I think, today for us to, as we think of the 50th anniversary, to think of these other groups as well in this country, because we are seeing other groups being beaten every day in the streets, particularly African American men being shot, transgender women being killed in the street. We have to be there for other groups in addition to being there for people we see just as ourselves. And I think maybe the failing of today's movement is a lack of empathy for people who are not like ourselves. Maybe not enough people care about the people who are in the bottom around the world. For me, that's one of the painful things about the modern movement.
And I always regard it as very short-sighted in just practical terms, because if we are isolated in our own silo, we are giving up a lot of strength.
Yes.
And that's what the people in power want. They want us to be divided into our own little pods and not talking to each other and not working with each other. So I think just in practical terms, whether you feel empathy or not, and I would like people to feel empathy, but I will appeal to them on practical grounds to say, if you want to make progress, if you want to overturn the hideous power structure or whatever, or accomplish anything, we have to work together. That is where we gain power.
But I think most gay people have the right attitude in their hearts. I remember during the Stonewall riot, the thing I'm most proud about that riot as memory was that all the straight people that were trapped in it were guided out. This was a riot against the police. These, from the street queens to the men in suits, whoever was fighting, all of us agreed that it wasn't straight people, our mothers or fathers or sisters, brothers. It was the police. I thought this was brilliant. I saw these people taken out. It was wonderful.
Now, Jamie, you're sitting here, and you have to explain this to people who come through as tourists. You've got a tremendous historic panel. What questions do you have for them?
Well, you put me on the spot. That's overwhelming. It's such an honor to just even be at the same table with you all.
Thank you.
I gotta say, I'd like to know specifically for kids, what it is that, if there was one thing that you could say to all the LGBTQ plus youth that are out there, because there's this interesting thing that's happened with all this progress. It's gone so fast that we have these wonderful queer identifying children that actually don't know about the struggle.
Right.
I have a task that I now have to let them know just how hard it was not that long ago, like yesterday, for us.
For me, it was valor. We were always denied a chance to show valor, and men love this. This men built their history on the idea of valor and battles and all this, and that was not a part of us. Like in one documentary, I said in the end of it, I was a man, even though I was just a big, loud fairy. But that was important. There was a great deal of valor in it. And that valor had a power of its own. There was no leadership, but certain people knew to go out and get more ammunition. Certain people knew to take the straight people out. It was an amazing sense of valor and battle. And when the morning came, I was exhausted like a gladiator. But nonetheless, that feeling that I now had too, of valor was a very, very important thing. And that's what these people need in their lives sometimes, these children.
I think that people, as someone who is a college professor and taught queer studies, that young people don't know our history. And they don't know how people of our generation suffered and the things that we had to go to. For example, the way I am dressed right now, in 1969, I would have been considered a transvestite because the unisex clothing that I might be wearing today did not exist. And so a fly front, for example, was considered men's clothing. So in 1969, I was a man. Today I'm a woman. And that kind of thing, that they don't know the degree to which people were oppressed, the price that people had to pay, that gay men and lesbians lost their children and their jobs because of their sexual identity, because they dared to go to a place like the Stonewall, that this was valiant. When I had students, one of the big changes I saw over the 40 years that I taught at Pace University was that my students became LGBTQ, and their parents were of all sexual identities, and they came to believe that these things were a given. Right. And they forgot that these rights were part of a process, but also that we don't, as Anne has pointed out earlier, we really don't have these rights, that these things are not really encoded in law, and these are very tenuous things that we have, and tomorrow they could disappear. And
they're disappearing today.
And we're going to be right back where we were, and that's important to come out, not just once a year, but to give something to the movement at least once a week. If you can give 1 hour a week, if you can give $10 a week, whatever it is that you can give to our movement, that you can give to other people in our movement, we can all do it. And we can all come out to everybody. Come out to another person. Do something. And that's what people relinquish. It makes me very sad to see that people still come out one day a year at the end of June, and the rest of the year, maybe someone knows, but not everyone. Mm-hmm. We're still at that very beginning point of history in some ways.
We can't blame kids for not knowing this. We don't teach it. So I see education as the next frontier. Yeah. And there's a lot of work being done across the country by educators to incorporate LGBTQ history or unerase LGBTQ history for students who are in middle school and high school. I'm working on a project now with the New York City Department of Education. It's a pilot program for 8th and 11th grade American history to incorporate our story.
So I'm happy to hear that. Great.
So, yeah, great. As David Carter, who wrote the Stonewall book, says, it's American history.
Yes.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And I had a battle with my publisher of my book, what was called Making History, Now Making Gay History. I considered it American history. They insisted on cataloging it as gay studies or gay interest. But it is American history, and you don't have to look far to see it. There are lots of stories that include our stories but haven't been taught. The Red Scare included the Lavender Scare because gay people were fired from their jobs in the 1950s as a matter of law from federal jobs. So I think it is important for all of us to work on that aspect of the movement, which is education. So these kids come to you not knowing. Of course they don't know, because they haven't been taught.
And we worked at the Hedrick Martin Institute and went into the schools, but in terms of systemic change in the schools, there was total resistance. We are not going to talk about this. You can talk to guidance counselors, you can talk to students, but not systemic.
But what I found in that work we did in the schools was that, yes, there was enormous resistance often from administrators, although some of them invited us in, but the kids were hungry for this conversation. And when you give them permission to ask questions that are not informed, to be ignorant, but curious, they really are just soaking it up.
Oh, they're willing if we give it, yeah.
I'm proud to report that we worked with the New York City Department of Education and the National Parks Conservation Association, not actually the National Park Service, but a separate group. We all came together. The Stonewall Inn actually offered us space without alcohol being served, and we had school groups come as a pilot program this fall. There are 240 Gender and Sexuality Alliance, like after-school programs around New York City public schools. So they are all there, untapped, waiting to learn. And so we were able to bring these kids in this fall, and they got to go into the bar. They got to meet one another, socialize with one another from different groups. You know how important that must be for gay kids. And then we were able to do some interpretation and get them to know their history.
And I have to cut you off because we're at the end of our time, but that's a nice positive note to end on. Thank you, Eric Marcus. Thank you, Martin Boyce. Thank you, Carla J. Thank you, Jamie Adams. And thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.